In the heart of West Africa, a nation is fighting for its survival, not against invaders from across the sea, but against an enemy that creeps through the darkness, strikes without warning, and leaves entire regions paralyzed with fear. This is the story of Burkina Faso's desperate gamble to reclaim control of its own streets, its own towns, and its own future. And it all comes down to a single brutal deadline: 72 hours. What you're about to watch isn't just another news story. It's a turning point. It's a nation at the edge, making choices that could reshape the entire region. It's the moment when a government decides that waiting, compromising, and conventional tactics are no longer options. And somewhere in the chaos and confusion, ordinary people are caught in the middle, desperate for safety, unsure if they'll find it. This is Operation Wibga 2, and it's happening right now. The Sahel region of Africa has become something that geopolitical analysts whisper about in warning. It's a zone of complete and utter collapse, spanning across Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and into northern Nigeria. The Sahel is experiencing what many experts now describe as the largest humanitarian and security crisis in the world, and most people have never even heard of it. The violence here doesn't make the evening news in Western capitals. There are no celebrity activists tweeting about it, but the devastation is absolute. Burkina Faso, a nation of roughly 22 million people, sits directly in the eye of this storm. For decades, this West African nation wasn't at the center of Africa's conflicts. It wasn't the place where jihadist groups planted their flags. But everything changed around 2015. That's when the violence started bleeding over from Mali next door, where Al-Qaeda and ISIS-affiliated militant groups had already established strongholds. What began as isolated attacks gradually became a tidal wave. Imagine waking up one morning not knowing if the roads you drive will still be there. Imagine sending your children to school wondering if they'll come home. Imagine that every day gets worse, every week brings more attacks, and every government promise feels emptier than the last. That's been the reality for millions of Burkinabe people. The violence wasn't just military. It was surgical, targeted, personal. By 2020, the attacks had become so frequent that they stopped making headlines. Schools closed, markets shut down. Entire villages were abandoned as families fled to what they hoped were safer cities. But the militants followed them. They adapted. They evolved. Every time the military thought they had a strategy, the insurgents found a new way around it. It became a deadly dance, and Burkina Faso was losing ground every single day. The statistics tell a story that numbers can barely capture. In 2019, there were fewer than 40 terrorist attacks reported in Burkina Faso. By 2023, that number had exploded to over 800. Think about that. 800. That means somewhere in Burkina Faso, almost every single day, there's an attack, a bombing, an ambush, a kidnapping, a massacre. The violence had metastasized from a regional problem into a national catastrophe. But numbers don't capture the human cost. They don't show you the widow clutching her children, refugees in her own country. They don't show you the young men who watched their entire communities burn and decided they had nothing left to lose. They don't show you the teenagers recruited at gunpoint, forced to become soldiers for causes they don't understand, fighting wars they didn't start. The government tried everything. They deployed troops. They launched offensives. They made arrests. And nothing worked. In fact, with each military operation, it seemed like two insurgents emerged for every one that was captured. The security forces were being stretched impossibly thin. Morale was collapsing. Soldiers were deserting. The nation was hemorrhaging. And the traditional solutions weren't stemming the bleeding. Then came the coups. Between 2021 and 2022, Burkina Faso experienced not one, but two military coups. In August 2021, soldiers overthrew President Marc Christian Kabore, angry at his inability to control the security crisis. Then, less than a year later, another coup toppled that government. The man who emerged from this chaos was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young military officer with a reputation for being uncompromising, ambitious, and willing to do whatever it took. What made Traoré different from his predecessors? He didn't believe in half measures. He didn't believe that the old ways of doing things, the democratic niceties, the international agreements, the conventional military tactics, could save his nation. He believed Burkina Faso needed to be shaken awake. It needed shock therapy. It needed a leader willing to break the rules to save the country. And so, in late 2023 and into 2024, Traoré launched what would become his signature policy, Operation Wibga 2. Wibga means uprising or revolt in the local Moor language. The name itself was a signal. This wasn't going to be another standard military operation. This was a revolution in security strategy. This was Burkina Faso fighting back with everything it had. The core of Operation Wibga 2 was revolutionary in its simplicity and its severity. The government identified that across Burkina Faso's cities and towns, there were sprawling unofficial settlements, slums, informal neighborhoods, places where authorities had almost no control, no surveillance, no real presence. And in these places, they argued, the enemy was hiding. Militants were planning attacks. Weapons were being stored. Intelligence was being shared. The insurgency had built shadow networks right under the government's nose, inside the cities themselves. So the government made a decision that would send shockwaves through the nation. They announced a 72-hour deadline for all unofficial settlements to be cleared. Completely cleared. Everyone had to leave. The deadline was absolute, non-negotiable. There would be no extensions, no exceptions, no mercy. 72 hours, 3 days. That's how long you had to pack your belongings, leave your home, perhaps a home your family had lived in for generations, and go somewhere else. Somewhere official. Somewhere the government said was approved. Somewhere monitored. The scale of this operation was staggering. We're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of people being forcibly displaced from their homes. The government's logic was cold and calculated. They argued that these settlements had become havens for terrorism, that by eliminating them, they'd eliminate the shadow networks the insurgency depended on, that by forcing everyone into official monitored areas, they could track potential threats. They could prevent militants from moving freely through the cities. They could finally take back control. But there was another dimension to this strategy that revealed Traoré's true vision. He didn't just want security. He wanted national mobilization. He wanted every citizen to feel like they were part of the fight. So alongside the displacement order, the government launched an unprecedented campaign asking ordinary Burkinabe to report suspicious activity, to watch their neighbors, to inform on anyone acting strangely, to become the eyes and ears of the state. It was neighborhood watch on a national scale. It was collective security through collective surveillance. It was the government saying, "We cannot do this alone. You must help us. Your vigilance might save lives. Your reports might prevent the next attack." For some, this was exactly what they wanted to hear. For years, they'd felt helpless, powerless, watching their country descend into chaos and feeling like there was nothing they could do. Now, the government was telling them they had a role. They had agency. They could contribute to their own safety. This message resonated powerfully with segments of the population who were desperate for action, any action that might stop the bleeding. Social media filled with testimonials from people supporting Operation Wibga 2. They called it bold. They called it necessary. They said their government was finally showing strength. They said this was what a leader should do, make hard decisions, even unpopular ones, to save the nation. The supporters framed it as patriotic duty, as national responsibility, as the only way Burkina Faso could survive. But as with all such dramatic government actions, there was another side to this story. And that side was deeply troubling. The humanitarian organizations that had been monitoring the situation in Burkina Faso began raising alarms almost immediately. They pointed out that the 72-hour deadline didn't account for the poorest of the poor, for people who literally had nowhere else to go, for families who couldn't afford to rent in the official neighborhoods, for the elderly, the disabled, the sick who couldn't be moved quickly or safely. What was supposed to be a security operation, they argued, was actually becoming a human rights catastrophe. International observers noted that the unofficial settlements that the government was targeting were, in many cases, home to some of the most vulnerable populations in Burkina Faso. Refugees from other conflicts, internally displaced people fleeing previous violence, people who had already lost everything and had scraped together a life in these informal neighborhoods. Now they were being told they had to leave again. Where were they supposed to go? The government's official answer was vague. There were supposed to be relocation centers. There were supposed to be resources. But the reality on the ground was chaotic. The infrastructure wasn't there. The resources were insufficient. The coordination was a disaster. And so, while security forces were clearing the settlements, many people found themselves on the streets, homeless, with their possessions scattered or seized. Images emerged, though few made it to international media, of families sleeping outside, of children with nowhere to sleep, of elderly people confused and disoriented by the sudden upheaval. The government's response was that this was a temporary situation, that things would be sorted out, that security had to come first, and that order had to be restored even if the price was high. This tension between security and human rights, between the collective safety and individual suffering, is the central moral dilemma of Operation Wibga 2. And it reflects a deeper question that's being asked across the Sahel and really across the world. How much freedom are we willing to give up for security? How much suffering of the few is acceptable to protect the many? Where's the line between necessary measure and oppression? Ibrahim Traoré, the architect of this operation, embodies this contradiction perfectly. To his supporters, he's a visionary, a leader who's willing to make the hard calls that weak, democratic governments can't make. A strong man in an age of chaos. Someone who understands that you can't negotiate with terrorism, that you can't compromise with people who want to destroy your nation, that sometimes you have to be ruthless to survive. His military background is evident in everything he does. He's young, in his late 30s, which makes him younger than many African leaders. He came to power through military coup, which means he wasn't beholden to the political establishment. He could remake the rules from scratch. And remake them he did. He's surrounding himself with military advisors. He elevated the military above civilian institutions. He made it clear that in his government, the army would lead, and everyone else would follow. But Traoré is more than just a typical military strongman. He's also a nationalist. He frames his actions not as dictatorship, but as national salvation. He talks about Burkina Faso reclaiming its sovereignty, about the nation no longer being dependent on Western powers or international institutions that he sees as weak and ineffective. He's cultivated relationships with Russia, with Mali's military government, with other nationalist movements across Africa. He's positioning himself as part of a new Africa, one that doesn't need Western approval, that doesn't need the United Nations, that will solve its own problems its own way. This message has electrified significant portions of the Burkinabe population, especially young people, especially those who feel like their nation has been humiliated, dominated, and forgotten by the international community. Traoré gives them a sense of pride, of defiance, of hope that their country will finally stand up and fight back. His supporters filled the streets when he came to power. They waved flags. They chanted his name. They genuinely believed he could be the one to end the violence, to restore order, to make Burkina Faso safe again. And they're willing to defend Operation Wibga 2 vigorously, dismissing critics as elites who don't understand what it's like to live in terror, as international meddlers who don't care about African lives, as weak-minded people who don't understand what winning requires. The regional context makes all of this even more combustible. Burkina Faso doesn't exist in isolation. To the west is Mali, which is in almost complete state collapse. The Malian government has lost control of vast swaths of territory. Jihadist groups operate openly. Trafficking networks move weapons, drugs, and people across borders with impunity. For Mali, the violence pours into Burkina Faso like water through a broken dam. To the south is Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, relatively stable nations that are now dealing with spillover violence as the insurgency reaches further south. To the east is Niger, which is experiencing its own security crisis, its own military coup, its own authoritarian response to insurgency. The entire Sahel region is in a state of near-total breakdown. This matters globally in ways that most people don't fully appreciate. The Sahel is becoming a haven for not just local jihadist groups, but for international terrorist organizations. ISIS franchises operate there. Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups have strongholds there. It's a breeding ground for extremism that could eventually reach Europe. It's a failed state zone in a region of geopolitical competition between great powers. Russia has moved in aggressively, offering military support and mercenaries from the Wagner Group in exchange for political influence and access to valuable minerals. China watches carefully, protecting its interests in the region. France, which has a long colonial history in West Africa, is slowly being pushed out as African nations reject its influence and embrace alternative partnerships. What happens in Burkina Faso matters for global security. It matters for migration patterns that will eventually reach Europe. It matters for terrorism that could hit targets far beyond Africa. It matters for the future stability of one of the world's most volatile regions. And right now, that region is watching to see if Traoré's bold experiment, Operation Wibga 2, will work. The early results are mixed and contested. Government officials claim that security has improved. They point to reductions in certain types of attacks. They argue that the displacement of the populations has made it harder for militants to operate freely in cities. They say that the citizen reporting initiatives have led to arrests and prevented attacks. They insist that the operation is working and that their tough approach was necessary. Critics point to different metrics. They note that violence hasn't stopped, just shifted. They argue that humanitarian costs have been severe and that the government isn't being transparent about the true scale of displacement and suffering. They worry that the surveillance culture being created will lead to abuse, to false accusations, to innocent people being detained or killed. They fear that by treating entire communities as potential terrorists, the government is creating new grievances that will actually fuel insurgency recruitment. And there's a deeper fear among international observers that in trying to defeat the jihadist insurgency, Burkina Faso is becoming more authoritarian, less democratic, more violent. That the cure might be worse than the disease. That Traoré, in the name of fighting terrorism, is building a security state that could be even more oppressive than any terrorist group. This is the classic dilemma of counterinsurgency. When you're fighting an enemy that's willing to die for their cause, that's willing to hide among civilians, that doesn't follow the rules of war, what do? Do you match their ruthlessness? Do you use their own tactics against them? Do you become what you're fighting in order to defeat them? There are no easy answers. But the choices made now will ripple through Burkina Faso for decades. Looking forward, there are several possible futures for Burkina Faso and for the broader Sahel. In the optimistic scenario, Operation Wibga 2 succeeds. The displaced populations are successfully reintegrated. The surveillance infrastructure prevents attacks. The security situation gradually stabilizes. Traoré consolidates power, becomes more legitimate, and perhaps even transitions toward greater democratic openness once the acute security crisis passes. Burkina Faso becomes a model for how to defeat insurgency in the Sahel. Other nations follow the model. Regional stability improves. In a second scenario, Operation Wibga 2 has mixed results. Some areas improve, others don't. The insurgency adapts to the new reality. They move deeper into rural areas. They become more brutal, escalating their attacks in response to the government crackdown. The humanitarian crisis worsens. International pressure mounts. Traoré faces pressure to moderate his policies, creating internal tension within his government. The region remains unstable, chaotic, unpredictable. People continue to suffer. But the situation neither dramatically improves nor completely collapses. In the worst-case scenario, Operation Wibga 2 backfires catastrophically. The humanitarian crisis becomes a full-scale emergency. Hundreds of thousands of displaced people create refugee flows to neighboring countries. The surveillance state becomes predatory, with the government using it to eliminate political opponents and settle scores. The insurgency, rather than being weakened, grows stronger because it now has a population made even more desperate and angry by government actions. Traoré faces a crisis, either from external pressure or internal dissent, and his government either becomes even more brutal in response or collapses entirely. The most likely future is probably some combination of all three, partial successes mixed with ongoing problems, creating a frozen conflict that persists for years or even decades. This is what we've seen in other counterinsurgency campaigns globally. The insurgency never completely disappears. The security situation never completely normalizes. But there's also no dramatic collapse or complete victory. Just a grinding, exhausting, costly stalemate. What makes Burkina Faso's situation unique is the scale and the stakes. This isn't a small country dealing with a localized problem. This is a nation of millions at the epicenter of a regional crisis that could reshape West Africa. The decisions being made right now in the capital, Ouagadougou, will echo through the entire region for years to come. And underneath all the geopolitical calculations and strategic considerations, there's the human reality. There are real people trying to survive, real families trying to find safety, real communities trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in abnormal times, real young people watching their futures collapse and wondering if they have any hope at all. Operation Wibga 2 represents a moment of desperation, of a nation at war with itself and with the forces that have infiltrated its borders. It represents a government deciding that conventional approaches have failed and that radical measures are necessary. It represents a leader willing to take massive political and humanitarian risks in the belief that it's the only way to save his nation. Whether it succeeds or fails, Operation Wibga 2 will be studied, debated, and discussed for years to come. It will be cited as a case study in counterinsurgency, in the limits of democracy in times of crisis, in the tension between security and human rights. It will inspire some leaders and warn others. It will be held up as either a necessary evil or an abomination, depending on who you ask. But most importantly, it will shape the lives of millions of ordinary Burkinabe people, whether they find safety or are driven deeper into fear, whether they trust their government or come to see it as an enemy, whether they believe their nation has a future or whether they decide to leave, to flee, to become part of the massive refugee and migration crises that are reshaping our world. The 72 hours are already up. The settlements have been cleared or are in the process of being cleared. The operation is underway. The surveillance networks are being built. The nation is being remade in Traoré's image. And the world is watching to see what happens next. This is a story that will continue to unfold. A story with no clear ending yet. A story where the stakes couldn't be higher, where the stakes are literally people's lives and futures. A story that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what we're willing to do to be safe, about how much power we're willing to give to our governments, about whether security without freedom is actually security at all. Burkina Faso is answering these questions through Operation Wibga 2. Whether their answers are right or wrong, we're living through a moment that will matter. We're witnessing a nation at a crossroads, making choices that will echo through history. This is what happens when a nation becomes desperate enough to risk everything. And this is far from over. This story is still unfolding in real time. The crisis in Burkina Faso and the broader Sahel region will only intensify in the coming months. The decisions made right now will shape the future of an entire continent. If you want to stay informed about geopolitical developments that matter, developments that shape our world but rarely make mainstream headlines, subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss critical updates as this situation develops. And if you want to understand what's really happening in the world, beyond the headlines, beyond the PR, beyond the simplified narratives, stick with us. Because these stories matter. These human stories matter. And someone needs to tell them. The question isn't whether Operation Wibga 2 will work. The question is what Burkina Faso will become in the process of fighting for its survival. That answer is still being written.